Hey, you ever played a role playing game that requires advanced algebra? Welcome to Traveler. And I'm only half kidding, but here we go. This is the Traveler book. It's one of the first role playing games I was exposed to after Dungeons and Dragons, one of those that was in that great gift box that my mom's coworker sent me once they found out I was getting into gaming. Just this cover inspired a lot of story ideas for me. Like, look at these guys. They're looking down the docking tube as if they're expecting something. They're carrying rifles. They're not military. Maybe this is a merchant crew? They've got kind of matching outfits on, but you get the feeling that maybe they're just adventurers. What are they waiting on? Is someone coming back and they want to get them aboard before they leave? That's why they're defending the docking tube? What's going on? Traveler is an awesome role playing game. But today, we're going to cover the original 1977 Traveler box set, not this compiled Traveler book that I started with. So let's jump over and take a look at Traveler at how it originally released. This is the cover of the Traveler box set, and I apologize for the graininess a little bit of the text. It has this great quote on the front. "This is the free trader Beowulf calling anyone. Mayday, Mayday. We're under attack. Main drive is gone. Turret number 1 not responding. Mayday. Losing cabin pressure fast. Calling anyone. Please help. This is the free trader Beowulf. Mayday." That really sort of sets a tone, doesn't it? This was a plain black covered box with a white back containing 3 small saddle stapled booklets known as the Little Black Books. They're roughly digest size, so an 8.5 by 11 page folded in half and stapled down the spine. Let's take a look at what's in them. Here is the first book of the 1977 release, Characters in Combat. Now, it's interesting to kind of muse that this is the same format that Dungeons & Dragons released in just 3 years earlier. But what you will find in Traveler is a much more refined game system. Now, there are still artifacts of this being the 1970s and this being among the first role-playing games to come out, but you will find that the rules have a certain amount of consistency that wasn't present in the original D&D. Largely, the folks behind Game Designers Workshop, including the principal designer of this game, Marc Miller, were wargamers. And so a lot of wargame thought went into Traveler, just like D&D, but rather than throwing new ideas at the fridge and seeing what stuck, there's much more of a coherent design aesthetic behind this. It is by no means a game with what we would recognize as a core mechanic today, but 2d6, 2 6-sided dice, do a lot of the heavy lifting. The subsystems may be a little different in how they do it, but it's there. Let's take a look inside the book. Now, you'll notice this is the reprint PDF from Far Future Enterprises, but this is as the game released in 77, aside from this. So, Characters in Combat. Copyright 77, volumes 1, 2, and 3, envisions a referee or umpire to supervise play or resolve questions. So, here's the table of contents. What we're going to look at first is character generation. How do we make a character in Traveler? And there is a lot of fun urban legends about this, most of them true. We'll look at how personal combat was adjudicated. And that is pretty much the extent of this first book. It keeps things focused on the characters and on personal combat, and other topics get left for the later books. So, it says that you require Traveler, books 1 through 3, some 6-sided dice. In fact, it almost barely refers to the number of sides on the dice, right? It just says dice, and then in parentheses, 6-sided, minimum of 2, up to 4 per player. Paper and writing instruments. It notes that hex paper could be useful, that miniature figures could be useful, and that an electronic calculator could be useful. And boy, howdy, let me tell you, in certain situations, yes, you might want one. Something that's interesting is the miniature figures at this point in time were coming from Marshall Metals in Cedar Park, Texas, which is right up the road from where I live and is actually the city in which I work. So, playing the game, they note that Traveler can be played solitaire, that there are scenarios available, that it is planned to do a campaign, like a science fiction series, and that in the dice rolling conventions, we are normally going to throw 2d6. The Traveler set uses the term throw instead of roll in most cases. It's just sort of a holdover from some of GDW's wargaming roots, and something that I still use that term when I'm running more modern versions of Traveler. So there is saving throw mentioned, dice modifiers or DMs to modify dice upward or downward. And these are all being talked about in a pretty general, consistent way because most of the game is going to use a 2d6 throw, modified one way or the other by situationals. So it's close to the core mechanic of a modern RPG, but it's not quite there yet. We have the referee, that is the term for the game master in Traveler. And it talks about how the referee can create their own star map and the worlds in it. And we're going to get to that. But bear in mind that Traveler, as it initially released, did not have the familiar Third Imperium setting that most Traveler players nowadays accept as the default. You literally created your own universe in which to play Traveler. So, characters. You have 6 ability scores, much like D&D, but they're slightly different. They also tend to run on a lower number scale, 7 being average, because they're generated by rolling 2d6. You would think they top out at 12, but they can actually go higher than that during the character generation process. So, you have strength, dexterity, endurance, intelligence, education, and social standing. Because Traveler takes its cues from some of the science fiction that was popular at the time, and it is a feudal space empire. So there are lords and dukes and emperor and knights, and so your social standing is important to the way this game plays. And you really have to put together your conception of the Traveler universe based on these little clues left in the rules. So you roll 2d6 for each of your stats and you put them together. Traveler uses an interesting fake hexadecimal system so that numbers above 9 are expressed with letters. 10 being A, 11 being B, 12 being C, and so forth. This allows you to do something cool we're going to see on a future page. So, you have noble titles for a high social standing, starting with knight at 11 and going up from there. Most of the professions you're allowed to participate in are military in nature, so your character will usually have a rank. To end up with a finished Traveler character, you roll your stats, then you go through the enlistment process. The services available are Navy, meaning Space Navy, Marines, Army for ground forces, Scouts, the Merchant Marine, and then Other, which covers everything else. There are some subsequent little black books that cover additional careers, Citizens of the Imperium being the main one that pops to mind. There are also individual books that go into much more detail on some of the careers presented here. For instance, the very next book in the series, Book 4 Mercenary, covers Army and Marine characters in much tighter detail. So, if you fail to enlist, that's right, you choose the service you want, you roll some dice, and you could just not make the cut. You are subjected to the draft. You roll a d6 and see where you end up. Characters go through careers in terms of 4 years each. So your character begins the enlistment process at age 18, And when they complete their first term, they will be 22. This is important because the more terms your character has under their belt, potentially the more skilled they are and the more money and equipment and other things that they've accumulated. But after a certain point, you can start losing your physical and eventually mental faculties to age. Now, you'll notice under terms of service, there's a heading for survival. Yeah, this is where all the jokes about characters dying in character generation come from. The rules as written in this original edition of Traveller are that if you blow the survival check, your character has died in the line of duty. This character is done, toss out everything you've done with them, and start over again. This plays into the risk-reward nature. Now, most games at this point in time used some sort of random character generation, and Traveller doubles down on that. Not only do you randomly roll your stats, but everything that happens to your character is done with a random roll. So your character could have a freak accident and die in their first term of service, and that's it. That character is gone. You could also face a situation in which your character is in a fairly dangerous profession. You want to pick up another skill or two, or maybe make that next rank. Do you opt to do another tour of duty and possibly fail that survival roll? Or do you decide to cut your losses and muster out of the service and start your character's adventuring career at that point? Commissions and promotions. I know as a kid, I had a hard time understanding exactly what a commission was. I think I was 11 years old when I first got the Traveller books, and I didn't realize the difference between enlisted personnel and officers, and that commission was the magic switch that flips to take you from one to the other. I remember rolling for commission repeatedly, even after a character had achieved it, and giving the character the additional skill bonuses that come with that. But you only roll for commission until you achieve commission, and then your character is a commissioned officer. That seems second nature to me now, but as a kid, I really didn't understand what I was looking at. So skills and training, you are given the opportunity to learn skills as you go through. Sometimes you'll pick up skills automatically based on the service you're in, or the service you're in combined with the specific rank you've achieved. The skills you have some control over, but not perfect control. You get to choose which table to roll on if it's one of the normal skills you earned during your tour of service, but then you do roll a die. So you can hedge your skills toward a particular thing you want to pick up, but you can't guarantee that you're going to get it. You roll for re-enlistment. The service could decide they just don't need you anymore. Or if you roll boxcars, 12 exactly, the service could require that you stick around. Your character can retire if they serve 7 terms. At least 5 terms, and they can retire. They can serve up to 7 terms voluntarily, and past that if the dice keep coming up 12 on the re-enlistment check. If you retire, your character actually gets retirement benefits. You get a little bit of money every year, and your character will, have some benefits associated with retirement. If you simply muster out and just leave the service, there are benefits that you'll get, but you won't get a recurring yearly retirement. The longer you stay in, the higher rank you make, the more things that you'll leave the service with. Once your character hits age 34, you'll have to start making saving throws to avoid losing physical stats. And I believe in your 60s, you start have to roll to avoid losing intelligence. So here's something that I think is really cool. The Universal Personality Profile. What that is because you can express your stats over 10, or as you were over 9, with letters, that means you can string your stats together into a 6-character string that functions something like a serial number. But it also sums up your character's ability scores because the abilities are expressed in a particular order. Strength, dex, endurance, intelligence, education, social standing. So a character that is average all the way across will have a universal personality profile of 777, 777. But one that's highly intelligent but otherwise average would be 77B, 77. So that's a little identifier that you could even use in game to be associated with your character. So the UPP is kind of cool. It's one of those quirky little traveler things that a lot of us look back on fondly. And so we have a note here for non-player characters, and at the bottom, gender and race. Nowhere in these rules is a specific requirement established that any character be of a specific gender or race. Any characters potentially of any race or of either sex. At a time period when AD&D is giving us stat caps for characters who are female members of their species, um, it's kind of refreshing that Traveler was looking forward in that respect. So here are the mustering out tables for the 6 services, and you can see that you roll a d6. It's possible to get a 7 if you have certain qualifiers, and it tells you what you could receive. Just for giggles, let's take a look at my personal favorite, the Merchant. I like playing members of the Merchant Marine. Um, you can be a smuggler, you could be a legitimate shipper, you could be part of the crew on a massive interstellar freighter belonging to some conglomerate. Most of us played free traders, space truckers, basically. But I could roll to see what I get out of my benefits. If I roll a 1, I get a low passage. That is a ticket to go somewhere on a starship in a hypersleep chamber, a freezer chamber. I could get +2 to my intelligence, as you were. That's the scout. +1 to my intelligence. I could get +1 to my education. Maybe I did some studying on those long interstellar trips. I could get a gun. The first time you roll this, it's a physical weapon. Subsequent times, you could take a different physical weapon, a second copy of the one you just got, or you could raise your skill. Blade is the same thing, but with bladed weapons. Traveler makes a big deal, one of those little world building details, about the fact that you don't want to be running around aboard a starship firing off firearms. And so blades and swords are considered to be very legitimate options if your ship is being boarded. I could roll blade. I could roll low passage again on a 6. If I have that magic +1 that comes with gaining rank 5 or 6 in the merchants, I could roll a merchant vessel and start the game with a ship of my own. Now, unless I roll that several times, I'm going to start the game with a ship and a hefty mortgage, which will keep you flying in search of fortune and glory. Below that is the cash allowance table. I could roll to get straight up money out of my career. You can get a bonus on that if you've picked up the gambling skill. So those are all the different things that you could pick up. Middle passages and high passages are possible. Think business class and first class. You could also pick up social standing. You could pick up membership in the Traveler's Aid Society, which is sort of a upscale traveler's hostel that will put you up when you arrive on planet. They will provide you with food, place to stay, some resources like libraries and things, and every couple of months they pay you a dividend of a single high passage, which you can use or you can sell and pocket the credits. Traveler's Aid Society memberships are highly sought after. So at the bottom we see the aging table. Intelligence isn't hit until you hit age 70, okay. But everything else starts to possibly degrade beginning at age 38. Strength, dex, and endurance. And those rolls get harder and the penalty steeper as your character gets older. So here are the service tables that give you an idea of what jobs are hard to get into, what jobs are hard to get promoted at, what jobs are hard to survive. So if you take a look, the most difficult service to get into here is the Marines. Now you can get a bonus toward that role if your intelligence and strength are high. The easiest service to get into is other. Unless you blow it with a natural 2, you're going to get into other. Now it is possible, if you see the draft numbers there, to fail to enlist voluntarily in the service you want and then roll the draft and end up in there anyway. That's perfectly cool. That is allowable in the game. So taking a look at survival, the hardest service to survive in is the scout service. I guess because you're boldly going where no traveler has gone before. Um, the Marines are slightly more difficult than everything else. And Army, Navy, merchants, and other have to roll a 5 or better, modified by a particular stat that's germane to that career. Now, you will see these numbers change as Traveler is revised and expanded later in its publication history, but this is how things stood when the game first started. To get an officer's commission, you'll note there's no entry for scouts and other. Scouts were initially depicted as not having a rank structure of any kind. This is retconned in the Scouts book that comes out in the Little Black Book series, but for now, Scouts get 2 skills for every tour of service, but they don't get any bonus skills for commission or promotion because there is none. Other just doesn't get the extra skills, nor do they have ranks. So, it is hard to get a commission in the Navy unless you have a high social standing. It's fairly difficult to get a commission in the Marines. In the Army, it's very easy to become commissioned. And in the merchants, getting commissioned is almost a formality. Getting promoted, that's something else. So for promotion, Army promotions are fairly simple. I've had a lot of characters make captain by the end of their first tour of duty. Merchants are very difficult to find promotion, which makes it really hard to get up to that merchant rank 5 of captain to even give you a shot at starting the game with a ship. This means a lot of merchant characters end up being older or end up being discarded and having a new character re-rolled as the player tries again and again and again to get a ship of their own. Scouts have a shot at a ship no matter what, but that ship still belongs to the Scout Service. So, taking a look at the promotion prospects, we see that it's easiest to get promoted in the Army, hardest to get promoted in the Merchants. Then we move to re-enlistment. This is where the Army has a downside. They've got one of the standard survival roles. They've got almost the easiest commission. They have the easiest promotions, but their re-enlistment check is a 7 or better, meaning there's about a 50-50 chance of your character getting booted out of the Army every term. So there's a whole lot of young, one-term Army personnel running around in Traveler. It's a little bit less difficult for the Navy and Marines. The Scouts will pretty much hold on to you forever, and I can't imagine getting booted out of other. You see the ranks at the bottom. In the original Traveler, enlisted characters simply had the name of their service and the number of terms they'd served. Navy 3, Marines 2. But once you were commissioned, you actually had a rank title to go with that. Lieutenants and majors and force commanders. In the merchants, of course, you had more merchant-sounding titles, 4th officer, 3rd officer, all the way up to captain. But these 2 pages of tables are the meat and potatoes of how to make a Traveler character. Here are the skill tables that you'll roll on. And you note that you have 4 options. Personal development, which is pretty much my character was trying to better themselves. I'm either raising my abilities, my attributes, or I am picking up skills that are sort of slice of life skills, like gambling or brawling. Service skills are things you might pick up in the day-to-day operation of your service. For instance, the Marines can learn how to drive an ATV, learn how to wear a vac suit, learn blade combat or gun combat. You'll notice that the Scouts and the Merchants on this table, on the service skills table, have access to a skill called Jack of all Trades. The Jack of all Trades skill is very much sought after because it basically confers skill level 0, the ability to roll an unmodified number on any other skill for every skill in the book. Your character is considered to have been around the block and learned a lot of things. And so your character can take a wild stab at any skill roll without a negative penalty. So Jack OT is pretty valuable to a character in the Traveler universe. You have the advanced education table. These are specialties within your service. And then a second advanced education table that is only accessible if you have an education of 8 or better. So you roll on these tables each time your character is granted a skill. Generally, you get 2 skills for your first term of service and 1 skill for each additional term. That may not sound like much, but the skills in Traveler are, each level represents a good chunk of knowledge. For instance, a character with medical 3 is assumed to be a full-on medical doctor, and with a high enough dexterity score, they're considered to be a surgeon. So if you think about that, level 3 skill is basically a doctorate. Level 2 is basically a graduate degree like a master's, level 1 being a bachelor's. So each level of skill is a huge amount of learning. So the book goes on to explain the skills and benefits, give us the specific type of weapon, because when you roll blade combat or gun combat, you must choose which specific weapon you're learning. There's explanations of what each individual skill does. We see an explanation of retirement pay and other benefits for mustering out. We get an example of character creation, good old Merchant Captain Alexander Lascelles Jameson, who I'm pretty sure ends up an NPC in a lot of Traveler campaigns. I know I've used him. And then we start looking at combat. Combat in Traveler looks very, very similar to something that you might imagine if you went back and say read Chainmail. We have weapon versus armor tables, and we have a set of weapon stats and what those weapons do. So we have die modifiers to determine surprise, and then die modifiers for terrain to determine the initial encounter range. Did the two parties stumble over each other at close range, or did they see each other from a good long distance away? This is a very cool idea that I thought was neat when I first read it as a kid, because again, I had only really become familiar with D&D where you were encountering things at swords point range, more or less. You know, you turn a corner in a dungeon or you walk into a room. There were lots of old dungeons that were notorious for being various monsters in various rooms. You open a door, oh look, gnolls, let's fight them. Random encounters out of doors. The DMs, when I was young, because they were young too, tend to basically drop the random encounter right on the party. It hadn't occurred to me that you might sight the enemy long before you're in engagement range so that you could try to evade, but Traveler gives you that opportunity here. And you take a look, the range bands are standardized. Weapons can fire out to different ranges, but the ranges themselves do not change. The ranges are expressed as close, short, medium, long, and very long. So unlike, say, weapons in the Battletech or Shadowrun role-playing games, each weapon doesn't have a class of ranges or a specific number for that given weapon. It might just say this weapon is good out to medium range, and you're good to go. So you have rules for movement that are abstracted. While you can use miniatures, you can really just use a piece of lined notebook paper and determine the range bands. In fact, they suggest doing something just like that. So combat resolution, the basic required throw is 8 or better on 2d6. Now in 2024, the latest version of Traveler from Mongoose Publishing, that's the core mechanic. Roll 8 or better on 2d6, not just for combat, but for all skills. This version of Traveler, you tended to find situational rules for skills in that section that we just flipped through. And that happened even more so as further books in the line added new skills. But here is sort of the genesis of the, okay, 2d6, 8 or better is what we're shooting for, and that is the core of this game. Wounding is done very differently. You don't really have a pool of hit points. You take wounds directly to your stats. Usually, I believe endurance is always the first stat to be hit, and then it's random after that. If a stat is reduced to 0, your character is in trouble. If all 3 stats are reduced to 0, your character is dead. So, characteristics give you bonuses to your rolls in combat. High dex is good for melee. High dex is good for ranged attacks. High strength is good for melee. But frustratingly to the modern player, it's not applied evenly. You have to look up the specific weapons and see what the advantageous levels are, and if so, how much of a bonus you're going to get out of it. Your skill expertise, your skill level, is added to the dice when you roll. There are morale rules, so opponents will not always fight to the death. And then there is a ton of lists of equipment, and again, you can see the wargaming roots of this because it's very specific about weapons. How long is the weapon in millimeters? How much does the weapon weigh in grams? What grams of bullet does this weapon shoot? So, for instance, the automatic pistol. It fits 15 cartridges in the handle of the pistol. It's 175 millimeters long. It weighs 750 grams. The loaded magazine is 250 grams. The bullets are 9 millimeter, weighing about 10 grams each. Very, very specific on types of weapon. So there's weapons and equipment. Here's armor protection. Armor does make your character harder to hit instead of subtracting from damage. And that requires that each type of armor have a chart that shows what each type of weapon will do to it. Here's something that's interesting, the antique equivalents. It always puts an interesting picture in my mind when I read this, saying that the carbine is equivalent to the Ruger Mini 14 or the Armalite AR-180. The revolver is equivalent to a Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum. This always gives me these mental pictures of these characters living in a high-tech society with starships and like rushing into battle with an M1 Garand or something. It's just very, very interesting that they use what now appears to be such retro examples for the futuristic weapons. So here is weights and prices. The body armor table's at the bottom. Cloth armor is the best 250 credits you'll ever spend. And we get into the tables. This means that yes, you are going to want to purchase or create a game master screen for yourself or print out all these tables and have them laying out in front of you. Nothing is specifically standard. So you do have to look up every different weapon versus every different armor. First, in this weapons matrix, you're adjusting the weapon for the armor that's being worn. The next table, you're adjusting the weapon for the range that you're fighting at. Both of those modifiers need to be included for you to get a final target number to determine exactly what you have to roll to hit. The wounds inflicted are listed down the right-hand side. You will also need to take a look at, let me see. Here we are. The third table. How high of a stat you need to get a bonus or how low of a stat imposes a penalty, and what those bonuses and penalties are, because they're different for every weapon. This does seem really fiddly to the modern eye, but it does give you an interesting tactical choice to make for type of weapon carried versus what kind of enemies are we going to be facing, what kind of armor are they likely to be wearing. So there is a point to it. There is a point. And that's the end of book 1. characters in combat. We're going to move a little bit faster through the other two books because I realize we are already at the half an hour mark and we've only gotten through the first book. So let's look at book 2, Starships. So we've got Starship Economics, Starship Construction, Starship Combat, Drugs, which is an interesting thing to put in this particular book, Experience, and Trade and Commerce. Now, why would Starship Economics be one of the first things you talk about? The standard sort of play loop in Traveller tends to be an eclectic group of people who formerly did some other job that are getting together and are traveling around the Imperium or maybe outside the Imperium, making money and doing dirty deeds. Generally, there is a ship involved. Generally, you are trying to make money with that ship, or perhaps even make money in order to afford the ship, which is what my friend Scott likes to talk about as the Merchants of Death campaign. Also, there's a lot of speculation that Joss Whedon must have played this game in college, and this is where the idea for Firefly came from. There is a whole lot of similarity in how the Firefly series was scripted and how a group of travelers runs around trying to get jobs, and curveballs happen while you're shipping cows from this planet to this planet. So let's dive right in. So when I made the joke in the cold open about having to know algebra, yes, this game is written by people who had an acquaintance with how rocket ships work. You accelerate to turn over, and then you turn over and decelerate until you reach your destination. The actual mathematical travel formula appears here on this page. So you can figure out where it is you're going at 1g of acceleration, which is how ship speeds are rated in this game by g's of acceleration. Interstellar travel is actually a little easier. Once you jump into jump space, you travel a number of parsecs equal to the rating of your jump drive in roughly a week. That's easy. But getting from planet to planet, bust out the slide rule. Now, they explain what a high passage, middle passage, and low passage is, and they also put in the possibility of a working passage. Your character could do work aboard ship to pay for their passage from point A to point B. We talk about hijacking. We talk about skipping your payments and running away. The galaxy is potentially a big place depending on how many dice your DM wants to roll. Piracy certainly happens. Piracy is certainly an option for your players. And there are things like lack of maintenance, contaminated fuel, drive failure, the dreaded misjump. Your engine's jumping you to a place you don't intend to go. And if it's out in the middle of nowhere, that's bad. So Starship Economics, this explains how you purchase the starship. This was one of my first exposures to how boned I would eventually be when I got a mortgage on a house. Like reading this at age 11 and figuring out, wait a minute, what do you mean I pay 220% of what the ship actually costs? Yep, sorry, that's adulthood. There are subsidies. In fact, you can buy subsidized ships where the ship is yours, but the government tells you where to fly and what to carry. The game talks about operating expenses. This is a very old-fashioned game designed to modernize, in which you are... Battletech players refer to this as accountant tech, where you almost need a spreadsheet to keep up with your character's finances and needs. But in Traveller, that was a feature, not a bug. That was an actual part of the play loop. So we have listings of crew salaries. What does maintenance cost? What does life support cost? How many passengers can we pick up on a given place? Do we carry Imperial mail? Because if we do, that gives us a certain amount of money for each trip we make. Starship construction, there is a full set of rules here for building your own ships. And good Lord, did I spend a lot of time doing this. I tried to stat the Jupiter too, because one of my favorite things during the summer was to watch reruns of Lost in Space and sit down with my Traveller books and crunch out ship designs. So all of the information is here for the programs you put in your ship's computer, to the size of the drives, to how thirsty the drives are for fuel. There's a lot of jokes made about Traveller and that the computers for the ship still weigh multiple tons and take up a whole room. So your ship can carry small vehicles or smaller ships. There are different standard ships presented. And there's checklists to take you through how to put the ships together. Starship combat is done with a vector system. We used to play this on my living room floor with yardsticks and measuring tapes and protractors. So that's kind of how this works. It's a little complex to a modern gamer, but it can actually be a whole lot of fun. Starships can be expressed on an index card. This is talking a little bit about how you do acceleration and calculate vector changes with the ships. It's all Newtonian. Imagine playing asteroids, but doing all the math yourself. This is the planetary templates to figure out the scale of a big circle of cardboard that we used to use for the planet, and then figuring out its gravity well. And then here are some standard worlds with the math already done for you. And of course, some more on Starship Combat. So there's a section on drugs. Traveller has always included these. Slow drug and fast drug for medical use or for putting somebody under. The combat drug, which basically makes you a combat monster, but then you receive wounds when the drug wears off. Anagathics arrest the aging process. Those are very sought after so that you can stay in character generation longer without starting the game with like Wheelchair Lopan from Big Trouble in Little China. There's all the different drugs. Here's the rules for experience. There really wasn't a level up system, and it took months, if not years, for your character to pick up a skill level because each skill level represented so much learning. Contrary to popular belief, there was an experience system. Here it is in the 1977 book 2, but it is not the sort of improvement system that we are used to. Trade and commerce is a very important part of Traveller. As I said, part of the assumed play loop is that you are going to be trading. You can either straight ship cargo for X amount per ton, or you can do some speculation and buy things here, hoping to sell them for more when you get where you're going. So there are classifications for different kinds of worlds. And there is a D66 table for what kind of cargo is available and what the base price of that cargo is. Die modifiers for purchase or resell tell you where you might want to buy said cargo and then where you might want to sell said cargo. And that is book 2. Jumping into book 3, Worlds and Adventures. This is the book where the referee is going to spend a lot of their time. And some of it is just straight up fun. So we talk about worlds, we talk about equipment the travelers have access to, how encounters work, encounters with animals, and we throw in the psionic rules, which we haven't covered yet. Worlds can have a starport, and there are different types of starport, from barely flattened out terrain with a fuel truck all the way up to a full-scale Class A starport. World occurrence, that number 1, I should have started with that. That is basically when you are creating your own subsector, what is the probability that a hex will have an inhabited system in it? You can adjust that number back and forth to make something more sparsely populated or more heavily populated. So, world creation, there is a number of tables to roll on. This is a subsector grid. You use this to map out the subsector with each hex representing 1 parsec, which is incidentally what a Jump 1 engine can cover. So you roll for the characteristics of the planet, and it gives you starports, the size of the planet, what kind of atmosphere the planet has, how much water the planet has. Then we find out other pieces of information like the population, the type of government, and the general level of law. Can your characters walk down the street with their M60 or space equivalent? So there's some advice on different types of worlds, like ring worlds or sphere worlds. You get a technological level that gives you an idea of what the general technology on the planet is like. At the time this was written, when we were in the 1970s, Earth was what they would have considered tech level 7. We have since advanced. So here's some tech level examples. So television came in at tech level 6. At tech level 7, we had hovercraft and we had spacecraft that were not starships. So Soyuz, Apollo, things like that. Different planets can have access to different levels of technology. So here's the checklist for creating your subsector. Here's the equipment that your characters have access to, and you'll notice there is a parenthesis next to each item of equipment. That is the tech level necessary to buy that piece of equipment. Once you start moving into the later little black books, especially, say, Book 4 Mercenary, you will see that there's a whole lot of things that refine themselves as tech levels go up, rather than just appearing at a given tech level and staying that way. So here's some ground vehicles. Here's how encounters work. The referee is taught about patrons. Here's some random people encounters. Patron encounters. We talk about the nobility a little bit. We look at a reaction table. And then encounters with animals, because you'll probably be running into a lot of things like this on Strange New Worlds. Scavengers, omnivores, herbivores. I tell you, playing Traveler at such a young age helped me out so much with classes that I took later in life, because I was one of those kids that would be introduced to one of these concepts and then I would go down to the public library and read about it. So Traveler and games like it really helped me academically later in life. So different kinds of animal types in different environments. Whether or not they attack, classifications of animals, their sizes and their natural weaponry, and then we get into psionics. Psionics was something that I didn't always use in my Traveler games because you have to test for it early in life. Your psychic skill erodes as you go through your careers. And so if you didn't get tested for psionics young, then when you finally do get around to it, you've lost several points of potential psychic strength. You can learn 6 possible psychic talents: telepathy, clairvoyance, telekinesis, awareness, teleportation, and special. Teleportation was one that ended up being used a lot in our game by alien marines that would just beam themselves aboard your ship. Traveler doesn't otherwise have transporters, but a group of Zodani marines with vac suits, poof, poof. Kind of scary stuff. And with the psychic system and skills, that wraps up the little black books. So, as you can see, Traveler has allowed us to build our own world, populate it with technological levels, our own animals, our own NPCs, everything from scratch, then roll up our PCs who potentially have years of experience under their belts before they venture out into the world. That was a very big difference from the first level character things that we ran into in the old D&D days. Traveler blew our minds. Traveler was awesome. And it was also a rule set that we could hang things on that we had not discovered there was a game for yet. I did run a couple of very Star Trek-esque games with this before I was very quickly gifted with the FASA Star Trek role-playing game, which we will go over in future books. That game has a lot of similarities to Traveler. So that's Traveler. I'm sorry we couldn't take a much deeper dive. We will in future videos do some dice rolling and show how some of these systems work, but I'm trying to keep the videos to a reasonable length. This one is already the longest one we've done yet. Traveler is definitely worth checking out. Classic Traveler is still worth playing. And the modern version, Mongoose Traveler 2nd Edition, smooths out a lot of the warts, adds a lot of really interesting content. It is also very much worth playing, and it's one of the few games that is an addition of an older game that I think maintains the feel and the spirit of the game in the best traditions. A lot of games, as they get more additions, they drift away from the original concepts, the original settings. New authors come in and they just don't have the tone the original authors did. That could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the game. But Traveler has held up remarkably well over the years. I highly recommend it. There is a single volume bound version of these 3 little black books that's available right now. You can pick it up on DriveThruRPG. I'm already signed up for a Traveler game at this summer's North Texas RPG Con. It was literally the first game I tried to get into. I highly recommend taking this for a spin. I really, really do. All right, everyone. Tell me what your thoughts are on Traveler. Is this the first time you've heard of the game? Is this the first time you've seen the original Little Black Books? Are they different from the 1981 Little Black Books you may have gotten your hands on? What are your thoughts? What are your feelings? What games would you like to see me cover in the future? And was the audio better on this video than it was on the last one? Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for those of you that have actually subscribed. I'm extremely flattered. And remember, character is what you are in the dark. This has been the Old Dragoon, out.